Hi, John Lambert with Biodiversity for a Living Climate, and I'd like to report on a field trip that a group of my friends from Bio for Climate made up to Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in Woodstock, New Hampshire on May 24th, 2024.
Another guy have been here for 30 years, so there's a lot of consistency in
When we arrived on Friday, we were greeted by Amy Bailey, who is a researcher, forest technician at the Hubbard Experimental Forest. We are also met Dr. Denise Birchstead, who was quoted in the book Beaver Land and is also a research scientist that has worked at Hubbard Forest Experimental Forest for many years. We gathered at the Robert Pierce Laboratory at 234 Mirror Lake Road in Woodstock, New Hampshire. Amy Bailey gave us an introduction to the facilities that were all around close by to this facility. Founding member and biologist Jim Laree, who led a discussion group regarding a book that we reviewed. The book was named Beaver Land, How One Weird Rodent Made America by Leila Philip. And in this book, it described some of the activities that actually were happening in Woodstock, New Hampshire, and it was interpreted by Dr. Denise Bouchard, who was quoted in this book. So luckily, we were able to get Dr. Denise Bouchard to give us a field trip into the area that she had mentioned.
Is that trying to scare you?
No. Difference of what it read 5 years ago, and then we can calculate growth per year. So that's the manual method, and that's the most typical method. But there has been question of more wanting things on a smaller time step, and we're getting more technology for this. And people are interested in, how long is the growing season? And when do trees really get active, and what controls are going? I would say at Hubbard Brook, one of our weaknesses is plant physiology. So we do all kinds of monitoring and measuring, but we don't have people who really understand all the dynamics of how the plant physiology works and how that's changing. So we put in these dendrometer bands that are automated, and that red box over there has the data loggers, and these wires come from these main junction boxes. And so we're just this is actually a pilot study. It's very close to the headquarters, and we're just trying to see how well these things work. And we had two different types of dendrometer bands. The point one, which you were saying the place that you follow, that's just a little device that drills a hole into the tree, and it collects the data right there. And so it'd be watching at that one spot how it's changing throughout the year. And then this is called a band dendrometer, and it's just swelling. So what happens is that when it rains, you are going to see a tree swell. Trees are so responsive to rain. They just move the water into the tree. And in the spring, when they move water into the tree and it expands, it stays expanded. So this is the time of growth. As you get longer into the summer and into the colder seasons, it will respond to the water, but a lot of times it shrinks back. So that's just the physiology of what's happening. It's called the diurnal flow, what's happening throughout the day. And it's not necessarily building the new cells that makes the next layer. Or the trees have the rings. So most of the cell growth is happening right now during this early part of the summer. And then in terms of the winter stuff, I do not know a lot about what you were describing, but I do know that we get our sugar maple sap in the spring before the leaves come out. And I think when that sap is running, these dendrometers would respond. So I wonder if we know that the trees respond in the winter. I don't think that they're actually building new cells at that point.
I think they're just
I think you need the phenology, the photosynthesis, and the food and all of that moving through to help.
Except that if there's, you know, like the
Dr. Kravchuk, who's Voices of Water and is very much into the hydrological cycle and capturing water where it falls and how the beneficial effects of tree transpiration. And he's saying that a 30-foot deciduous tree that's on a summer day can transpire a few hundred gallons of water, equal to about 5 room air conditioners. So it isn't just the shade that you feel from walking in a forest, but it's the transpiration. That transpiration absorbs thermal heat, you know, the heat of evaporation, and it's running that up to the higher atmosphere and hopefully getting it away from our planet and cooling our planet. Not, I mean, doing a whole bunch of other things too. So anyway, trees are great.
Yeah, that's cool. Someone asked me how much water moves through a tree in a day, and I was like, I'm sorry, I don't know that one either. I've got to figure that out.
A big one can be 100 gallons, even
Yep.
more.
Yep.
200 gallons depending on the climate and the growing conditions. Yeah.
Wow.
But
Yeah,
I also
definitely.
have heard that all this excess transpiration that's happening, and it's warmer, where you can hold more water in a warmer setting. And so it's this feedback where we actually, that's what helps feed these torrential downpours, is all this evapotranspiration with the warmer air conditions. And
But it's a small water cycle when it's formed over land, as opposed to a large water cycle formed over big bodies of water like the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a very good effect when it transpires moisture and forms a small water cycle. You know, the pollen from the tree helps seed those clouds to make it rain too. So the cycle is more frequent and less severe typically when it's formed over a forest. From what I understand, you're the expert.
oh, no, I don't have.
Hopefully,
I just take care of the instruments.
you're doing a great
Try
job.
to understand what the scientists say, but it's very hard for me. This particular network, they wanted to just look at what was in the rainwater. So they have this sensor that's heated, and when it rains, it causes the lid to open, and then we just collect the rain, and then it's heated so it dries when the weather ends, and the lid covers the bucket. And we come out once a week, and we take that into the lab and do a few things, and then we send it off to a central lab that everyone's sending their thing to. And that's part of the Atmospheric Deposition Network, NADP. And you can go online. This was first established after one of our earliest researchers, Dr. Gene Likens, put a trash can out here, this very setting, and he let the rain collect in there for a month or so, and then he took the sample into the lab and he discovered that it was a low pH and started sharing that around, and people got curious about it and what the regional differences were in terms of what was in the rain, and so now it's a national thing based on Hubbard Brook research.
Most of the river valleys studied in Hubbard Brook, with good reason, are very steep. Those gauged watersheds that Amy had mentioned before are on really, really steep slopes. They need to be because they need to keep their water budget really tight, and they can't have water wandering around, which is exactly what I'm about to show you, is water wandering around all over the place.
Which is what we want.
Which is what, so wonderful. So you've come to the upper valley instead of the lower valley where the gauged watersheds are. So I chose this site for, I'm going to zoom in a little bit further, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this well from where you are. Let me see if I can find one that's mapped. I was mentioning to somebody who was asking me about my kid and asking if he studies beavers. As it turns out, he's the one who generated this map. He's the one who created these this particular view of it. And these dotted lines, can you see, if you look in really close, can you see how it's like steep and then a little bit thing and then it's steep again on the other side? That dotted line is running through it. Those are marking out, and I could see them when I was, in 2014. I was like, oh my gosh, look at that network of channels that are just abandoned in the woods. They weren't running water, but they're river channels. Kind of like what you would find at a delta, where you have channels that form and then they get abandoned. Oh, thanks. So I would walk in the woods and I would see these channels totally filled in with soil and leaves, and water had clearly not run in them in a very long time. And I thought, if the beavers were here, the beavers weren't here yet, they would dam this up and the water would come out of there and it would go into these channels, and actually the logs would do it. And so I proposed in 2014 to create a log jam to reactivate these paleo channels. So I've been watching this site since then, since 2014. I didn't do the study. The folks here at Hubbard Brook really graciously allowed me to, and then I was busy with a full-time job and being a mom, and I didn't want to do a big research study as well. I just decided against that phase of my career. And then the logs came down and made a log jam at almost exactly the spot that I had proposed. And then the beavers, as if by magic, and then the beavers built a dam against the log jam. As it turns out, I have a lot of documentation of the conditions, visual only, photographs only, before this happened, because I had been proposing this particular experiment to reactivate the river channels, the side channels rather, and I didn't need to do anything. And now the side channels have been some of them are reactivated, some of them aren't, and that's much of what we're going to see today. So I had mentioned to John in an email, like, just a heads up, the beaver dam blew out. So the beaver dam against that log jam blew out in probably December. So now it's back to just a log jam. The log jams are very, very important, as you probably are familiar with already. It's not just the beavers that block up. There's lots of processes that create natural barriers in rivers. The beavers
Feel free to say lots
are
about
one.
that. The
Yeah.
interaction between those things. This is if you want.
Cool. Yeah, we'll see more, a
Please.
little bit more of it. I'll show you more of it when we get to the site. Although you won't be able to see it with the beaver dam, but I'll show you some pictures so you can.
Logs that are slowly decomposing.
That's exactly what it is.
Overturned and holes that
That's exactly
the
what
roots
it
left
is.
behind. And
So,
Yeah.
do we have everyone? Do we have the? So there was a question, and just to point out something that Amy had mentioned when we were starting, that you can have in places kind of sort of old growth like soils. I mean, don't go saying that I said old growth, because this isn't old growth by any means, but these soils are much less altered than many, and what you have is this incredible amount of variation. Sometimes it's called hummock and hollow.
Yeah.
You have
Pit
these
mound.
mounds that are made from the trees that have been fallen long ago
Pit
and
mound.
have turned into soil with the hollows around them. So this is a really nice example of what that type of old growth like. Older soils, less impacted might be a better way
The
to
uprooted
phrase
roots
it.
create a hollow.
but that
and the rotting
soft
trunk
feeling
feeds
It's
too.
it.
so
I
love the
soft.
soft feeling.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And there's some places where it's really, really soft, and I'm quite convinced that there's a whole mat on top of old sphagnum, actually, right? So we've got layers of soils
Yes.
that are really, we won't get to that spot today, but yeah, there's places like that.
And it's a fairly mature, relatively closed canopy, isn't it?
Yes, quite.
It feels that way.
I mean, depending on how you define mature,
Right.
This is certainly, again, almost everything was logged.
Relatively.
Is this? Yes, this is my old yellow birch, I believe. Is the
Ah.
botanist here to correct me?
Yes, it is your
Um,
yellow birch.
So, thank you for the confirmation. So this is one that has been around a long time. The bark is really different from the classic yellow birch that we see. And there's quite a number of these that are really quite old around here. Because again, they high graded. They just cut the best wood, and the yellow birch was quote unquote junk. But please don't take it personally. I don't think it's junk. These trees are really, really, really important now in terms of a lot of the structure of the forest. And in the forest ecologist would be like, whatever, it's the old trees. But for me, these matter a great deal, because most of the logs that end up in the streams that are blocking the water flow are these old ones, because these are the ones that are old enough to be big enough to be blocking up the river. So I care a lot about these old yellow birches. Plus my name is Birchstead, so. About fish, if you look at this stream, like, look at how, I mean, frankly, it's beautiful. It's just so lovely to look at the water. You can see the stones. They're so, like, the colors of the different rocks is really, really gorgeous. Because there's nothing alive to get in the way.
There's no nutrient
There's no
density.
algae, there's no moss, there's almost nothing growing in these streams. They are low nutrients, like you said. They're also high pH, I'm sorry, high acidity, low pH, like Amy was saying. And this is slightly elevated because of the acid rain problem. It's still a legacy, as Amy had mentioned. The calcium and the magnesium and the other base cations, they're called, that are in the soil that would increase the pH of the rainwater have been leached out. And so we have a bit of a legacy from the acid rain, so the water in the stream is still slightly more acidic than it would be, but it would be acidic anyway because the rocks are acidic. We don't have those base cations in the rocks. We're called the granite state. It's not granite, but that's okay. It's still granite-like. It's more metamorphic and so on, but that doesn't matter. The key is it's not like the Vermont or even some places in New York where it has the calcium and the other base cations. Exactly. Those ones are calcareous and these are not.
And that means fish do better in those conditions.
They do much better. This also has a closed canopy, which is wonderful for the temperature for fish. But if there's nothing to eat, that's very bad for a fish. And there's nothing to eat because we don't have the algae or mosses that are growing on the rocks that would support the insects that would support the fish. So these are very, very biologically unproductive streams, and so they can't support many fish. Trout, I am pretty sure to this point are still the only fish that are found in these streams. And in the words of one of my colleagues, they're on a starvation diet. They are very, very small because there's just not a lot for them to eat. And that's that productivity word again. Amy was talking about the productivity of the forest, but you can talk about the productivity of the stream. I mean, a stream that's really, really productive, like you could mow it, right? It's like there's so much algae on it that that's a very productive stream. It's not good for other reasons, but it's really good for making food for a food chain. And
there's a low sediment load in this, isn't there?
This does actually have a relatively high amount of sediment for the region.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's relatively steep, and right now you can actually see, for those of you who, standing down here on the bank, you probably can't see it from the back. There's some sands and stuff, and there's some deposits of sands. You're standing on one right here, which is showing you that it was actually fairly recently deposited on top of the leaf litter. So the water has been out of the banks, almost certainly due to that log jam that you can just see downstream from here. This is just a taste of what we'll see in terms of the river being connected to the riparian zone. I call this riparian rather than a floodplain. A lot of folks would call this the floodplain, but in a lot of the geomorphology, like super ultra nerd vocabulary, a floodplain has some very specific processes that this doesn't really have. Even though it's flooding and it's sort of flat like a plane. Riparian is a better term, which just means it's being influenced by the running water. So I'll use that. Here, we'll have some other spots that might be easier to see that. But what you're looking at is these cobbles here that are on the bank there are most likely coming out of that bank, being eroded out. So you're looking at these glacial till deposits. And then on top of that, we have a little bit of mineral soil and then the duff layer on top of that. This spot we call the charcoal tree because there's these little pieces of charcoal that are here right in this layer. You can see that this looks really blackened, and I won't tell you if this is ash or some other organic because I'm not good enough to know that. But this is the layer where you find the charcoal as well. This layer where you see it blackened. I don't know if somebody saw me here as I was kneeling down. I was just looking here, like right underneath at the base of the organic layer. You can find these pieces of charcoal. So I have a couple of them in a Ziploc bag that still needs to get sent to the lab. There we go. We got a couple over there. Still needs to get sent to the lab to be dated, to get a date. But it's underneath the organic layer, so it appears to be fairly old. So we are really curious to know how long ago this burned. And it burned it probably burned fairly rapidly and large to be making charcoal, as opposed to a lower fire. So there's the understanding here is that the woods here haven't traditionally burned. which is why it's a big deal to us to keep track of this. And so rivers always have stuff that fall in them, and they don't fall back up. It's not, this is as close as I would get.
She's talking about this split.
And that's a yellow birch right there, isn't it?
No, this is another spruce.
Yeah.
This is leaning over.
And there's one right here also that's falling down. So these are falling down because the bank gets undercut. The water just does what water does. It undercuts the spot. The trees fall down, and then they never fall back up. And so this tree here has been down for quite a while. It just finished falling. It was much more hanging. It wasn't all the way touching the other bank the last time I was here. It's finished falling, and now what you're seeing is other trees that have fallen upstream have been carried in flood, and their branches and sticks and whatever are getting caught behind this main tree. So this is called a key log. Like to use the technical term, I'm going to get all technical on key log.
We're going to say that to everybody we know.
Yeah, that's the key log. Yeah, and they're going to be like, how can you speak in such riddles? And then what's happening, this is becoming a log jam. And so lots of people will refer to this as large woody debris, and I tend to avoid that term. The same colleague who told me that the fish are on a starvation diet is the one who says that we shouldn't call it debris because it suggests it's bad, and this is essential for the river structure. And you can see it's doing really interesting things here. There's this bar on the side that's really different. As you look up and down the river channel, it gets much more homogeneous again. This is catching, because the logs are there, it's catching the sediments that are traveling down the river. It's also forcing the water out further upstream where we were standing, where there was sand on the riparian area right there. There isn't sand here. Downstream, there isn't sand on the bank. It's just upstream because the water was being held back. There were, so this log jam is creating this diversity, and it's also deepening the water, which is really important for the fish. It's catching the leaves, right? I pointed out to you, like, look at how clear and beautiful the water is. That means there's no food, but if you can catch some leaves, all of a sudden you've got lots and lots of food. The bugs will colonize those leaves. Well, actually, the bacterial mat colonizes the leaves, and then the bugs eat the bacteria, and then the fish can eat the bugs. So you need these for the fish, you need them for the river, you need them for the water connections, like the way that John was describing earlier. These are incredibly important, and they are devastating to infrastructure. So we burn a spectacular amount of fossil fuels to take these out of the rivers. Because again, the gravity just only goes that way, and we've got to go against it. We've got to keep pulling the things out of the rivers. And so I'm 5 feet tall, and so I'm going to say that this channel is 4 feet 8 inches deep, right? Because I can just I'm like eye level with the ground.
And is this just last December's storm?
No, this has been here like this for quite some time, but it's definitely cut more out. And I'm just curious how much looks freshly eroded. I mean, you can see like the sticks that were jammed in here, right? So these were being carried, and you can see the force. You can see the force of this thing, like this got jammed in to the down. And that area from where we all are this is fresh, with fresh deposits. But if you just look, we're like in a little scour hole, and we're gonna walk down that, and that is stable, and it hasn't changed very much at all, really.
Is this considered highly erodible soil under the
What was that?
Is this considered highly erodible soil under?
I do not think it would be, but I don't know. This is glacial. It's mostly glacial outwash till, and with a little thin veneer of a forest soil on top. So I wouldn't call it that, but I don't know what they would call it. And so the last time I was here, I don't know if you can tell from where you are, but if you can see my hand here, this is about where the edge of the ground is. That's separating the bank from the main stem of the Hubbard. So it's right about here is where there's still soil. The rest of this is just root hairs. The last time I was here, the edge of the soil, there weren't all these exposed root hairs. The edge of the soil was probably about here. So we did lose a good amount. It did erode like a couple of feet. I'm waiting for this to capture the river. So this is like a spot. That's why those cameras are trained on this spot, because I really am anticipating the main stem of the Hubbard to start flowing this way. So
Interesting, because I was on the coast on an island at the time of that storm, and watched whole banks disappear.
yes, right. And this little thing is still hanging on.
Yeah, I know. That's why I'm amazed. Yeah.
But this is the power of the tree roots. You know, so John was, I think it was John, was, you know, waxing about the value of the trees and the importance. And here's another one, right? They're holding the soil together. So even that incredible amount of force wasn't able to break through it. Again, my eyes can pick, but this spot is very, very clear, and I can show it to you. So we can start to put some brackets around the dates of things. So we know that this channel came through. It might have been cut off by the logging road, but this current alignment is after the road was built 100 years ago. And as you look at the map, you can see how this road works to sort of keep water in on this side. Evolution doesn't make sense. That's not how evolution works, right? Evolution works
based on
by
intelligence.
right.
I mean,
Well, and by selecting behaviors that promote survival.
Yeah.
And a behavior that promotes survival is not one that burns up a lot of energy for no use whatsoever.
Yeah.
That's just
it has
not.
to be efficient.
That's not
period.
an adaptive
Yeah.
life strategy. So again, it just doesn't work for me as an explanation. There's a tiny little beaver dam right here that looks mostly like a log jam at this point, because again, they've largely abandoned this site. I have noticed that next to their large dams, they'll build lots of these smaller ones. So while this site is really active, they were starting their process of building the small ones here on the side as well. And again, you can look at, like, back to the question about a river channel, like you can look, like up here we've got forest soil, the water's coming off, the main stem Hubbard is right over there, it's coming off in this direction. This section right here has flowed like feet deep. You know, and you can see it now that I say it. It was obvious already. But it's flowed, you know, as deep as that channel up to here, off the main stem of the Hubbard, and getting caught here. But you can see it didn't erode. Like there's still forest soil here with a little bit on top. Once it got over that beaver dam, it eroded out. There's a scour hole at that beaver dam, and then it made a stream channel downstream, right? That looks like a regular old stream channel with all those cobbles. Those are eroded out in place. That's making the stream bed on top of. And then if you just go a little bit further, and then the stream bed stops. This is the stream bed that is in process of, sometimes it's forest soil, sometimes it's sand deposition, sometimes it's cobbles that have been eroded out and just dropped in place. This is stream channel formation in process. So this is not a channel that's just being restored, right? It's being created. This is a fresh one. But yeah, this is the spot I said to go back again. So that yellow birch right there, that big one hanging over, that's the yellow birch. That's the one in 2014. I stood like right about in this exact spot with my feet like right about here, and I said to Ian Holm, like, that's the tree that I'd like to pull down to make my experimental log jam. It was that tree.
10 years later.
And yeah, almost exactly. It was more like 5-6 years later. A little tiny, you can't even see it, a little tiny red maple fell down right here on the other side of this yellow birch. You know, maybe 10 centimeters in diameter. And it got hung up on that boulder, and then the next big tree came down and got hung up, and then the next one, and then the next one, and the log jam from upstream that I had mentioned broke, and I think that all got stuck here. And then we ended up with this. So yeah, it was this tiny little red maple.
Got a tree you're going to run right into right there. And you don't want to get too far that way because that's taking you right straight to the water.